Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1: The Yorkshire Summons. The telegram that would throw my friend Hercule and I into one of the most perplexing situations in our lengthy acquaintance arrived on a gloomy Tuesday morning in late October. In our cozy apartment in Whitehaven Mansions, I was having a leisurely breakfast when George Poirot's spotless valet knocked and came in, carrying the well-known yellow envelope. In his quiet, polite style, George said, "A telegram has arrived for you, sir," placing the silver salver next to Poirot's neatly organized morning letters. Poirot, who with his customary meticulous attention to detail, had been enjoying his morning chocolate and croissants meticulously, raised his eyebrows a little. Using his napkin to wipe his superb mustaches, he then used his little well-groomed fingers to pick up the telegram. "Dear," he said, looking over the message. "Most intriguing, Hastings. We have a Yorkshire summons here. Yorkshire, I may have used more force than was necessary to put down my coffee cup. It seems like a really gloomy time of year for a trip north, don't you think?" "Yes, mon ami. But pay attention to this." He read out loud after clearing his throat. "Immediate. A brother was killed in the Tower of Blood. Police are perplexed by paranormal activity. I need your help now. Grimby, Nigel. Yorkshire's Grimswood Grange." My toast almost choked me. "Extraordinary conditions. I'm saying, Poirot, surely you don't intend to involve yourself with ghost stories and whatnot." With careful movements, my pal folded the telegram, his gray eyes gleaming strangely. "Ghosts, Hastings, mais Poirot. He believes in murder rather than the paranormal. Yes, that is always the most human and natural. And the small gray cells that can unravel the enigma are always present when there is murder. However, I objected when this man directly brought up supernatural conditions. I think that's a bunch of bullshit. That's precisely what makes it so fascinating, my friend. It is because they have something very serious to conceal that someone wants Poirot to believe in ghosts." That very afternoon, I was sitting next to a Poirot in a first-rate railway carriage, watching the London suburbs give way to the increasingly desolate countryside, despite my misgivings about chasing ghosts across the Yorkshire moors. By the time we arrived at our destination, a little rain had started to fall, and the October sky was gloomy and heavy. Grange Grimwood looked like a character from a Gothic romance. Its old stones are black from age and moisture. Although the main house, which was constructed in the Tudor style, was spread out over well-kept grounds, the medieval tower was the focal point of the property. Possibly 100 yards from the main building, it rose from a little slope. The circular stone tower appeared to loom almost ominously over the estate. As we got out of the motorc vehicle that had picked us up from the station, I said, "Good Lord," and pulled my coat around me. Doesn't it give one the chills instead? With his keen eyes, Poirot scanned the area, absorbing every aspect of the massive building in front of us. Most atmospheric, to be sure, yet look at Hastings' windows. They're kept up nicely. The grounds are well maintained. Regardless of Mr. Nigel Grimby's financial concerns, this is not the place for paupers. The main house's heavy oak door opened, and a guy came out to greet us before I could inquire how he had inferred financial difficulties from a telegraph. Even though Nigel Grimby was tall, neatly dressed in country tweeds, and possibly in his early 30s, there was a noticeable anxiety in his demeanor. Even though his dark hair was well groomed, his hands shook a little when he walked up, and his grin appeared forced. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, thank heaven you've come so quickly." There was an obvious note of strain beneath the well-bred, sophisticated tones in his speech. I'll admit that I wasn't sure where to look. The situation is quite unusual, and the local cops are totally lost. Formally, Mr. Grimby Poirot bowed his head. "Please allow me to offer my sympathies for your brother's passing." I promise you that Hercule Poirot will make every effort to find the truth. The truth? Nigel laughed bitterly and repeated, I don't know what that word means anymore. Come view the tower where everything took place. Maybe you'd like some refreshments. First, though, it's a lengthy drive from London. I couldn't help but notice the quality of the furnishings as we followed him inside the house. They were obviously priceless antiques, but they had that slightly worn look that suggested a family, keeping up appearances despite difficult circumstances. There was proof of a centuries-old legacy everywhere, with portraits of grim-faced forebears staring down from paneled walls. Poirot noted, Your family has owned this estate for some time, I perceive, as we were escorted into a cozy sitting room, with a large stone fireplace that was blazing hospitably. Since 1487, Nigel grinned in response. Grimswood Grange has been the home of Grimsbys for 20 generations. On the 21st, my brother Crispin was born. He made a little correction in his voice, and the tower in which this catastrophe took place. We have always referred to it as the Bloody Tower, which was constructed as part of the original fortifications in the 14th century. I'm afraid its past is very bleak. A number of deaths throughout the ages, such as Lady Constance Grimby's. In 1598, sightings have been reported since. I couldn't tell if Poirot was amused or intrigued by the small twitching of his mustaches. What kind of sightings, Monsieur? The ancient tower loomed black against the gloomy sky as Nigel looked toward the mullioned windows. His voice was no more than a whisper when he spoke again. They believe that when misfortune is going to strike our family, the Grey Woman, Mr. Poirot, walks the battlements. 3 nights ago, she was spotted once more. As he spoke, the fire appeared to be dull, and I saw that I was pulling my chair closer to its warmth. Chapter 2, Yorkshire. The household at Grimswood Grange. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the air sharp with the promise of winter. I found Poirot already dressed and examining a detailed plan of the estate grounds with his customary methodical attention. He had spread the aged parchment across the breakfast table, anchoring its corners with the salt cellar and sugar bowl with typical precision. Ah, Hastings, you are awake at last, he observed without looking up. Regard this plan, it is most instructive. The tower, she stands quite separate from the main house, connected only by this gravelled path, most isolated, Nesper. Rather, I agreed, helping myself to kippers from the sideboard. I say, Poirot, shouldn't we be examining the scene of the crime first thing? Patience, my friend. First, Poirot must understand the people. The tower she will wait. She has waited already. For many centuries, but the people, they change their stories. They forget the important details. They convince themselves of what they wish to believe. Today we meet the household. Nigel Grimby appeared punctually at 9 o'clock, looking somewhat more composed than the previous evening, though I noticed his hand still betrayed a slight tremor when he lit his morning cigarette. I've arranged for you to meet everyone this morning, he announced. My sister-in-law, Seraphina, is in the morning room. Dr. Thorne is in his study as usual, and Jenkins is about his duties. Where would you prefer to begin? With the lady of the house, if you please, Poirot replied, carefully folding the estate plan. It is always most instructive to understand the domestic arrangements. Seraphina Grimby was indeed a striking woman, though not in the conventional sense I had expected. She possessed an almost ethereal quality that made one think of Raphaelite paintings, tall and willowy, with auburn hair that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows of the morning room. Her pale blue dress seemed to float about her as she moved, and there was something in her gray eyes that suggested depths of feeling carefully controlled. Mr. Poirot, she said, extending a slender hand. Nigel tells me you've come to help us understand what happened to poor Crispin. I confess the whole affair has left me quite bewildered. Madame Grimby, Poirot bowed formally over her hand. Permit me to express my sympathy for your loss. Your husband, he had been in good health recently. Oh yes, quite robust for a man of 43. She seated herself gracefully on a silk-covered chair, her movements fluid and precise. Crispin was always careful about his constitution. He took long walks about the estate each evening. Said it cleared his mind for his business affairs. Ah yes, the business affairs. Your husband, he was much occupied with such matters. A shadow passed across her delicate features. Increasingly so, I'm afraid. These past months he seemed quite preoccupied, always locked away in his study with correspondence and ledgers. I sometimes felt I scarcely knew him anymore. I observed Poirot's sharp attention to this revelation, though his expression remained pleasantly neutral. And on the evening of the tragedy, madam, you were where? I took my usual walk in the gardens. After dinner. I'm afraid I find the house rather oppressive in the evenings. So many shadows and memories. The fresh air soothes me. She touched her throat with one pale hand. I wore my gray shawl, as the October evenings are quite chill. After taking our leave of the lady, Nigel led us through a maze of corridors to Dr. Silas Thorne's study. The room was a bibliophile's paradise. Every wall lined with books from floor to ceiling, ancient volumes bound in cracked leather, competing for space with newer academic texts. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. Dr. Thorne himself proved to be a man of perhaps 50, with the slightly stooped shoulders of one who spent his life bent over manuscripts. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles held the keen intelligence of a scholar. When we entered, he was examining what appeared to be a medieval manuscript with a magnifying glass. Dr. Thorne, Nigel announced. These are the gentlemen I mentioned, Mr. Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings. The historian rose with evident enthusiasm, setting aside his work carefully. Mr. Poirot, what an honor. I followed your cases with great interest. Such a methodical approach to the mysteries of human behavior. You are too kind, Doctor. I understand you are the authority on the history of this estate. Indeed, indeed. 20 years I've been cataloging the Grimsby family records, documenting the legends and traditions. Fascinating material. The Grey Lady alone has appeared in family accounts dating back to the late 16th century. Most interesting, Poirot murmured. And you yourself, Doctor, you have perhaps seen this apparition. Dr. Thorne's eyes lit up with scholarly excitement. Not until recently, I must confess, but 3 nights ago, the very night of poor Crispin's death, I witnessed the most extraordinary sight. I was taking my evening constitutional around the grounds, when I observed a gray figure gliding near the tower battlements. Quite unmistakable, really. You were walking alone at that hour. Oh yes, quite my habit. I often take late walks when I'm wrestling with a particularly difficult historical problem. The night air clarifies the mind wonderfully. Our final interview was with Jenkins, whom we discovered polishing silver in the butler's pantry with the mechanical precision of long practice. He was a man of perhaps 60, with the ramrod bearing of an old soldier and the discreet manner of a perfect servant. Yet I detected something in his pale blue eyes, a carefully controlled resentment perhaps, or merely the weariness of long service. Jenkins, Nigel said with apparent discomfort. Mr. Poirot would like to speak with you about the night Sir Crispin died. Certainly, sir. Jenkins's voice was carefully modulated, betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. I served Sir Crispin his dinner as usual that evening, 8 o'clock precisely. He seemed somewhat agitated, I thought, though he said nothing specific. Agitated in what manner? Poirot inquired gently. He kept glancing toward the windows, sir, as if expecting someone. When I brought the second course, he asked if there had been any visitors. I assured him there had been none, but he seemed unconvinced. And your own movements that evening? I retired to my quarters at 9, sir, after ensuring the house was secure. I heard nothing unusual during the night. As we made our way back to our guest rooms, I found myself thoroughly confused by the various accounts. Each member of the household seemed to have perfectly reasonable explanations for their whereabouts. Yet something felt distinctly wrong about the whole business. Poirot, however, appeared thoughtful rather than puzzled, his green eyes holding that peculiar gleam that I had learned to associate with the early stages of his mental processes. He paused at his chamber door, one hand on the polished brass handle. Most instructive, Hastings. Most instructive indeed. We have here a household where everyone walks alone in the evening, where the master fears unwelcome visitors, and where the dead return to walk the battlements. Tomorrow we shall examine this mysterious tower where impossibilities become possible. Chapter 3. The Bloody Tower's Secret. The morning air carried a distinct chill as Poirot and I made our way across the gravel path toward the infamous Bloody Tower. Even in broad daylight, the ancient structure possessed an undeniably sinister aspect, its weathered stones dark with age and moisture from the previous night's frost. The circular tower rose perhaps 60 feet into the gray Yorkshire sky, its medieval battlements creating jagged silhouettes against the low-hanging clouds. Voila, Poirot murmured, pausing to survey the scene with those sharp gray eyes of his. Here we have the scene of our impossible crime, Hastings. A locked room in the truest sense, or so it would appear. Dr. Thorne had joined us for this expedition, his scholarly enthusiasm evident as he gestured toward the tower's base. The original construction dates to approximately 1380, he explained, his breath forming small puffs in the cold air. Built as part of the estate's defensive fortifications, though it's been largely decorative for the past 2 centuries. As we approached the heavy oak door, I could see why the local police had been so thoroughly baffled. The entrance was a massive affair, reinforced with iron bands and medieval hinges that looked capable of withstanding a siege. A modern mortise lock had been fitted sometime in the recent past, but the door retained its original iron bar mechanism, a heavy beam that could be lowered into brackets on either side of the frame. Dr. Thorne continued, producing a large brass key from his coat pocket. But when they forced entry, they discovered the inner bar had been lowered as well. Quite impossible to manage from the outside, you see. Poirot examined the lock mechanism with his characteristic attention to detail, his small fingers tracing the metal surfaces with delicate precision. Most interesting in this key doctor who normally carries it. Sir Crispin kept it along with keys to all the estate's historical buildings, part of his responsibility as the family head. Do you understand, Prachissimo? And where was this key found? Still in Sir Crispin's pocket when the body was discovered. Another confounding element, I'm afraid. As Dr. Thorne unlocked the door, I heard the heavy mechanism turn with a grinding sound that spoke of centuries of use. The door swung open on hinges that protested with a low groan, revealing the tower's dim interior. The space within was circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with stone walls that rose unbroken to the vated ceiling some 15 feet above. A narrow stone staircase spiraled upward along the wall, leading to what I presumed were the upper chambers and battlements. Medieval arrow slits provided the only natural light, creating thin shafts of illumination that did little to dispel the gloom. The body was discovered here. Dr. Thorne indicated a spot near the center of the stone floor. Sir Crispin was lying on his back, the dagger protruding from his chest. No signs of struggle. According to the police report, Poirot had already begun his methodical examination, moving slowly around the perimeter of the chamber with that peculiar precise gait of his. He paused frequently, sometimes kneeling to examine the stone floor with his magnifying glass, other times running his fingers along the ancient walls. You mentioned the dagger came from the estate's collection, Doctor, he inquired without looking up from his inspection. Indeed, a 15th century piece from our medieval weaponry display. It disappeared from the museum room 3 days before the murder. though we only noticed its absence the following morning. Most convenient timing, observed dryly. And the museum it is secured. Oh yes, locked each evening. But all the family members have keys, of course, as do I. In Jenkins, we often have visiting scholars who require access. I found myself growing increasingly frustrated as I watched Poirot's painstaking examination. To my eyes, the tower chamber appeared exactly as one would expect, ancient, dusty, and thoroughly forbidding. Yet my friend seemed to discover significance in every shadow and corner. "Hastings," he called suddenly, "observe this area near the wall. What do you see?" I approached the spot he indicated, a section of floor near the base of the staircase. To my eyes, it looked like the rest of the chamber. Stone flags worn smooth by centuries of use, covered with a fine layer of dust. Nothing particularly unusual. "I'm afraid," I admitted. "No, my friend. Look more carefully here. You see these slight marks in the dust, and there these scratches on the stone itself." Despite his guidance, the signs remained largely invisible to me. Dr. Thorne, however, leaned in with scholarly interest. "Fascinating," he murmured. "I've spent countless hours in this tower over the years cataloging the various historical inscriptions, architectural details. I don't recall noticing those particular markings." "Ah, but when did you last examine this section closely, Doctor?" "Why not for several months at least. My recent research has focused on the upper chambers and their connection to the Grey Lady legend." Poirot continued his circuit of the chamber, paying particular attention to the base of the walls and the junction where floor met stone. At one point he spent nearly 10 minutes examining what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary section of medieval masonry. The construction methods of this period, Dr. Thorne explained as we watched Poirot work, were quite sophisticated. "These walls are nearly 4 feet thick, designed to withstand both siege weapons and the elements. The builders often incorporated hidden spaces and passages for various purposes." "Hidden passages," I exclaimed. "You mean there might be another way in or out?" "Oh, quite possibly. Many medieval towers included such features, escape routes, storage areas, that sort of thing, though I've never discovered any evidence of them in this particular structure." Poirot had moved to the narrow windows, testing each one with gentle pressure. The openings were barely wide enough for a cat to pass through and set some 8 feet above the floor level. Even if they had been larger, the drop to the ground outside was considerable. "These windows," he mused, "they have never been enlarged or modified. Not to my knowledge. They remain exactly as built, typical arrow slits of the period, designed for defense rather than comfort." After nearly an hour of examination, Poirot finally straightened and brushed dust from his perfectly pressed trousers. His expression held that thoughtful quality I had learned to associate with significant discoveries, though he shared none of his conclusions with us. "Most instructive," he announced. "This tower she holds many secrets, but not all of them concerned the supernatural, I think." Dr. Thorne's eyes lit up with scholarly curiosity. "You've discovered something about the Grey Lady legend. Perhaps, Doctor, perhaps. But first, Poirot must consider what the physical evidence reveals. The stones, they do not lie as people sometimes do. They record faithfully what has passed." As we made our way back toward the main house, I found myself thoroughly perplexed by the entire business. The locked room puzzle seemed genuinely impossible. Yet Poirot's manner suggested he had detected something significant during our examination. The autumn wind picked up as we crossed the grounds, sending dead leaves skittering across the path before us. Behind us, the bloody tower stood silhouetted against the gray sky, keeping its ancient secrets as it had for centuries. Past. Chapter 4. The Shadowy Night. On the afternoon after our inspection of the bloodied tower, Poirot was at his most meticulous. In an effort to accurately reconstruct the events of that fateful night, he had set up one-on-one interviews with every member of the household. I must admit that I found his methodical technique to be a little boring. But I had learned to trust the operations of those renowned little gray cells from my extensive experience. As we sat down for our initial interview in the library, he explained that it was Voyou Hastings. The murder did not occur in a vacuum. It was the result of a series of occasions, each of which had its own significance. We need to know not just what happened, but also when and how it happened. Our first subject, Mrs. Seraphina Grimsby, came into the library with the same airy elegance I had seen the day before. I saw that she walked with the unconsciously graceful grace of someone used to being praised, and she was dressed in a deep blue wool dress that complemented her hair and face. Mrs. Crispin Poirot started up with his usual formal greeting. "I have to ask you to think back to 3 nights ago. Are you able to remember that night's specifics?" "I'll give it a shot, Mr. Poirot, but I must admit that everything feels a bit surreal right now." Her skirts were arranged with a studied elegance. As she sat down, dinner was served at 8 o'clock, as was customary. Although Crispin didn't say much during the lunch, I assumed he was quite distracted. "What kind of preoccupation, ma'am?" He continued to look out the windows as though he were waiting for someone. Crispin inquired as to whether there had been any visitors or messages when Jenkins delivered the port. "We don't often get calls in the evening, so I thought it was kind of strange." And as was his habit, Crispin went to his study after supper. After spending maybe 30 minutes in the drawing room, I made the decision to go for my evening stroll. The house, with all its memories and shadows, might feel a little oppressive at night. Pugh's eyes were keen with curiosity as he leaned forward a little. "Could you elaborate on your walk, madame?" "I always take the same path via the herb garden and back through the rose garden near the ornamental lake. It takes about 45 minutes. She stopped and put one pale hand to her throat. The evening had become extremely chilly, so I put on my gray shawl. It's Scottish cashmere that Crispin's aunt gave him for their wedding. Even while Poirot's countenance stayed pleasantly neutral, I observed that his eyebrows raised almost imperceptible. "At this detail, this gray shawl is one of your favorites." "Yes, I wear it a lot when I go for walks in the evening. The material is delightfully warm against the Yorkshire air, and I think the color fits me." "And did you notice anything out of the ordinary while you were out on a walk, maybe by the tower?" Seraphina's calmness wavered a bit. "As I passed the tower grounds, I did notice something odd. Near the battlements, a grayish figure appeared to be moving. I initially believed it would be overlooked, but the shape was too clear and intentional. I have to admit, it gave me quite a turn." "When would this have occurred?" "Perhaps 9:30 or a few minutes after." I quickly made my way back to the house. I was really unnerved by the image. Nigel joined us after Mrs. Grimsby left, and he appeared much more weary than when we had initially met him. I noticed that his normally flawless appearance was displaying indications of pressure as his hands trembled while he lit a cigarette. "Nigel," Poirot said gently, "you understand that we must address the evening of your brother's death." "I realize. It hurts, but it's necessary." Naturally, Nigel spoke steadily, but I could hear stress in his tone. "I worked through some business letters in the estate office during the evening. Crispin had asked me to study certain paperwork relating our financial condition. These documents focused on the things that really important." Nigel felt a flush creep up his neck. "A variety of investments, real estate issues, etc. When it came to estate work, Crispin was always meticulous." As he spoke, his hands began to shake more visibly. "You worked alone in the office?" "Yes, until around 10 o'clock. After that, I read a book in my room." He seemed to be struggling with an internal decision as he paused. I should add that Crispin had recently been worried about some business pressures. He thought we might have to make some tough choices regarding the future of the estate. Poirot became more focused. "Decisions of what kind, monsieur?" "You understand? Nothing certain. Just conversations on how to maintain the estate's sustainability." Though he was realistic about financial realities, Crispin was always protective of family customs. Jenkins's interview was equally enlightening. The old valet came in with his usual military swagger, yet I could feel a hint of emotion beneath his tough exterior. "You served Sir Crispin his last dinner, Jenkins," Poirot started. "What did you think of him that night?" "I would say rather upset, sir. Normally, Sir Crispin was a gentleman with a steady routine and a composed demeanor. That evening, however, he seemed eager, apprehensive perhaps. What was the manifestation of this?" "He inquired constantly about guests, sir, if anyone had called, and if there were any messages. When I assured him there had been none, he seemed doubtful. He also asked about nightly routines in the home, who would be on the grounds, and other things, most interesting, as well as your personal actions that night. I cleared things at 9:15, served dinner at 8, and then secured the home as normal. At 9, I retired to my quarters." Jenkins paused for a second. "I might add, sir, that I saw Mrs. Grimsby coming back from her walk just as I was shutting the front door. She looked a little upset." Another piece of the puzzle of the event was revealed by Dr. Thorne's account. The historian's scholarly enthusiasm seemed to outweigh any uneasiness regarding the unfortunate circumstances, and he was eager to communicate his insights. He told them, "I was in my study until quite late that evening," as he pushed his glasses closer to his nose. "I had been looking at some really intriguing medieval manuscripts about the legend of the Grey Lady. I made the decision to go for a quick stroll at 9:45 in order to decompress, and I headed toward the tower during this walk, Doctor, with the intention of observing the battlements under the moonlight, just for atmospheric research, you know. When I got closer, I saw the most amazing thing." Poirot leaned forward curiously. "Please continue." "Against the white stones, a gray figure could be seen moving along the highest level of the tower. As the folklore says, the movement was smooth, nearly floating. Before the figure vanished, I think I watched for 5 minutes. You know for sure the time, very sure. When I first saw the apparition, it was 10 o'clock and the church bells had just rung. By the time our interviews were over and we went to our rooms for the night, I was completely confused by all of the different stories. The schedule appeared to be rather straightforward, but there was something about the entire enterprise that seemed really off. Instead of being perplexed, Poirot seemed thoughtful. He stood by our sitting room window, gazing out toward the dark silhouette of the bloody tower against the nighttime sky. "Most fascinating, Hastings. We have here numerous witnesses to our Grey Lady, each witnessing her at somewhat different times. And we have a victim who expected undesirable guests, a brother anxious about business affairs, and a family where everyone seems to wander alone in the darkness." He glanced away from the window, that strange sparkle in his green eyes that I had come to identify with the beginnings of comprehension. "We will explore these mysteries in greater detail tomorrow. I believe it would be prudent to keep our windows locked and our ears perked up tonight. The Grey Woman might be able to walk once more." Chapter 5. The Missing Dagger. The morning of our third day at Grimswood Grange dawned grey and blustery, with autumn winds rattling the ancient window panes and sending leaves scurrying across the estate grounds. I found Poirot already engaged in his morning correspondence, his precise handwriting covering several sheets of cream-colored paper. "Ah, Hastings," he greeted me without looking up from his writing. "I have been making certain inquiries regarding our late Sir Crispin's business affairs. Most illuminating. I think you will find." "Business affairs?" I helped myself to breakfast from the sideboard, noting that the household had maintained its excellent standards despite the recent tragedy. "Surely you don't suspect this is some sort of commercial crime? Patience, my friend. All will become clear. But first, we must examine this famous dagger that delivered the fatal blow, the weapon. She will tell us much about the murderer's method and planning." An hour later, we made our way to the estate's private museum, housed in what had once been the Elizabethan wing of the main house. The collection occupied several rooms on the ground floor, displaying centuries of Grimsby family artifacts with the careful attention to detail that spoke of scholarly curation. Mrs. Penelope Whitmore, the museum's curator, met us at the entrance with evident nervousness. She was a small bird-like woman of perhaps 55, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and spectacles that seemed perpetually askew. Her hands fluttered constantly as she spoke, betraying an anxiety that appeared to run deeper than mere concern over the recent tragedy. "Oh, Mr. Poirot, I do hope you can make some sense of this dreadful business," she began, her voice carrying the refined accent of educated Yorkshire gentry. "I've worked here for 15 years, and nothing like this has ever happened. Nothing remotely similar, Madame Whitmore," Poirot replied with his customary courtesy. "You discovered the dagger's disappearance on the morning following the murder, I understand." "Yes, exactly. So I arrived at my usual time, 8 o'clock sharp, to open the museum for Dr. Thorne's morning research session. When I went to dust the medieval weaponry display, I immediately noticed the gap where the Grimsby ceremonial dagger should have been." She led us through a series of well-appointed rooms filled with family portraits, ancient documents under glass, and carefully labeled artifacts spanning several centuries. The medieval weaponry occupied a substantial display case in the third room, its contents arranged with museum-quality precision. Here, Mrs. Whitmore indicated a velvet-lined space between a battle-axe and a morning star. The dagger was displayed point downward, handle uppermost, exactly as you see with the other pieces. It's a 15th century piece, probably Italian workmanship, with an elaborately carved bone handle and Toledo steel blade. Poirot examined the display case with his characteristic thoroughness, paying particular attention to the lock mechanism and the arrangement of the remaining weapons. I noticed that several other pieces appeared equally deadly and historically significant. This case, it is secured each evening. Oh yes, religiously. I lock it myself before departing, and Dr. Thorne has specific instructions about security. The family is quite protective of their historical artifacts. And who possesses keys to this case? Mrs. Whitmore's hands fluttered more nervously. All the family members, of course, and Dr. Thorne, myself, and Jenkins. We occasionally have visiting scholars who require access, so several keys are necessary. When did you last observe the dagger in its proper place? 3 days before the murder. When I conducted my weekly inventory, everything was perfectly in order. Then she paused, adjusting her spectacles with trembling fingers. I should mention that the case showed no signs of forced entry. Whoever took the dagger used a key. Poirot's examination revealed subtle but significant details that had escaped the local police. He pointed out slight scratches on the velvet lining where the dagger had rested, suggesting it had been removed with considerable care rather than haste. "Most interesting," he murmured. "This theft, it was planned with precision, not committed in a moment of passion. Someone wished to acquire this specific weapon well in advance of using it." As we concluded our examination of the museum, Nigel Grimsby appeared looking even more haggarded than the previous day. His clothes, while still well-tailored, showed signs of careless dressing, and I noticed his hands had developed a persistent tremor. "Mr. Poirot," he began without preamble, "I've discovered something in Crispin's study that I think you should see. Letters, rather unpleasant ones." He led us to Sir Crispin's private study, a masculine sanctuary lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. The room still carried the faint aroma of pipe tobacco, lending it an almost ghostly atmosphere of its former occupant. "I was going through Crispin's correspondence," Nigel explained, producing a small bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. "These arrived over the past several weeks, rather threatening in tone, I'm afraid. The letters, written in an educated hand on common stationery, made for disturbing reading. They accused Sir Crispin of betraying the working classes condemned, his capitalist exploitation, and made increasingly specific threats about retribution for your crimes against the people. Good Lord, I exclaimed after reading the first few. These are from some sort of radical agitator. Sounds like one of those socialist troublemakers who've been stirring up unrest in the industrial towns. Presses him. What I thought, Hastings. Nigel agreed eagerly. Crispin had been receiving pressure about some of his business investments. There are people who object to his involvement with certain manufacturing concerns. Poirot, however, seemed less convinced by this apparent revelation. He examined the letters with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the handwriting and paper quality. These threats, they are serious indeed, he acknowledged. But observe, mes amis, the hand that wrote them. It is educated, controlled, not the script of a violent revolutionary, I think. While I remained convinced we were dealing with an outside agitator, Poirot's attention turned to other matters. He spent considerable time examining Sir Crispin's financial records, his sharp eyes scanning columns of figures and investment documents with methodical precision. The estate's financial situation, he inquired of Nigel. It is as precarious as these documents suggest. Nigel's face flushed deeply. Rather worse than I'd hoped, actually. Crispin had been exploring various options for maintaining our solvency. Some of them quite drastic, such as the possibility of selling portions of the estate, or even Nigel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He'd been approached by industrial developers interested in the entire property. This revelation struck me like a physical blow. The thought of Grimswood Grange, with its centuries of history and tradition, being sold to factory builders, seemed almost sacrilegious. Our investigation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Thorne joined us in the study, carrying a slim volume bound in dark leather. I've just recalled something that might prove significant, he announced, his scholarly excitement evident. This book, Legends and Lore of the Yorkshire Grimsbys. I lent it to someone in the household just last week. Given the recent supernatural manifestations, I thought you might find it relevant. Poirot accepted the volume with evident interest, immediately opening it to examine the contents. The pages were filled with detailed accounts of family legends, historical events, and folklore spanning several centuries. I noticed that many passages had been underlined in pencil, and there were marginal notes in what appeared to be different handwriting from Dr. Thorne's scholarly script. Most instructive, Poirot murmured, studying the annotations with particular attention. These notes, Doctor, they are not yours. Oh no, definitely not my hand. Whoever borrowed the book was clearly taking detailed notes about the Grey Lady legend and the tower's architectural features. Quite thorough research, actually. And to whom did you lend this volume? Dr. Thorne's brow furrowed with concentration. I am afraid I can't recall exactly. It was someone from the household, that much I remember clearly. But which specific person? He shook his head apologetically. My memory for such details isn't what it once was. As we returned to our rooms that evening, I found myself more confused than ever by the multiplying complexities of the case. The threatening letters seemed to point clearly toward an outside enemy. Yet Poirot appeared more interested in internal family matters and borrowed books. I say, Poirot, I ventured as we settled into our sitting room. Surely those threatening letters provide a clear motive. Some radical agitator bent on revenge against capitalist exploitation. My friend regarded me with that peculiar expression I had learned to associate with his moments of greatest certainty. Mon ami, the letters, they are certainly threatening. But ask yourself this. Why would a revolutionary from the industrial towns choose to murder Sir Crispin in a locked tower using a medieval dagger while dressed as the family ghost? Such drama, such elaborate staging, it speaks not of political conviction, but of something far more personal. Chapter 6. The Grey Lady's Secrets. By our fourth morning at Grimswood Grange, I must admit, I was getting more and more frustrated with Poirot's seemingly sidetracked approach to the investigation. Even if those menacing letters looked like ample proof that we were dealing with either supernatural powers or outside foes, my companion seemed intent on pursuing the smallest, seemingly unimportant minutiae of daily life in the house. Over breakfast, unable to control my annoyance any longer, I said, "Poirot, surely we ought to be studying the supernatural manifestations or concentrating on those revolutionary letters. The ghostly elements have obviously confused the local police." "Ah, mon ami," he answered, applying marmalade to his toast with his usual deftness. "You wish Poirot to chase the ghosts, n'est-ce pas? Excellent. In fact, we will look into these paranormal occurrences in further detail today." To my astonishment, Poirot's initial recommendation was that we go to the village and talk to the locals about the legend of the Grey Lady. Instead of dismissing such tales as superstition, as I had expected, he appeared to be sincerely interested in getting community testimony. Perhaps 2 miles from the estate was the village of Grimswood, which consisted of a single coach-in hotel and a group of stone houses grouped around an old church. Despite the fact that Poirot's reputation had clearly preceded him, the locals greeted us with the mix of wonder and reserve that characterizes Yorkshire people. We met the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Martha Fielding, at the Swan and Crown. She was a robust middle-aged woman with keen eyes and a clear love of dramatic storytelling. She placed down pints of ale before us with solid authority and said with clear joy that I, the Grey Ladies, had walked those battlements for almost 4 centuries. My mother saw her once during the dreadful winter of 1847, and my grandmother saw her twice during her lifetime. Most intriguingly, Madame Poirot supported her with the recent sightings and unusual attention. Could you elaborate on the specifics of what the witnesses saw? Those who saw her described her as clear as daylight, a tall figure in flowing gray, moving along the upper level of the tower as if she were floating rather than walking. Always shows up when the Grimsby family experiences tragedy. She does. The clothes were clearly gray. Oh, I'm as gray as the sky in Yorkshire. It's referred to as a shroud. Others believe it to be one of those vintage gowns, but it's always gray and always blows in the wind. Similar stories from a number of other villages were presented to us, each embellishing the legend in their own unique way. The gray coloring, the flowing movement, the location close to the battlements, and the consistency of some details were what I found to be significant. However, Poirot appeared less concerned with the supernatural ramifications and more with the exact timing and detailed descriptions. Old Tom Bradshaw, the village's senior resident at 83 years, proved particularly informative. I saw her for myself, just 3 nights past. Was walking back from my daughter's cottage when I spotted the figure clear as anything against the pale stone, moved like mist she did, but purposeful like the times you remember it. Precisely just past 10 o'clock. It were church bells had finished striking when I first noticed her upon our return to the estate. I discovered examining Sir Crispin's study with renewed intensity, particularly his business correspondence and financial records. Among the papers scattered across the mahogany desk, I noticed several documents that made me pause with growing alarm. "Good heavens, Poirot," I exclaimed, scanning a particularly official-looking contract. "Look at this. Preliminary agreements for the sale of Grimwood Grange to Hartwell Industrial Enterprises, dated just last month." Poirot examined the documents with his characteristic thoroughness. Most illuminating Hastings, it appears Sir Crispin was indeed exploring drastic solutions to the estate's financial difficulties. When Nigel joined us an hour later, I could not contain my shock at this discovery. His reaction was immediate and devastating. The color drained from his face so completely that I feared he might collapse. "Sale agreements," he whispered, sinking into the nearest chair as if his legs could no longer support him. Crispin was negotiating to sell Grimswood Grange without telling me. "I'm afraid the documents seem quite conclusive," I said gently, though I felt rather brutal delivering such news. Preliminary negotiations with industrial developers. The proposed sale price is substantial, but it means the end of everything. Nigel finished, his voice hollow with despair. 21 generations of Grims, and it would all disappear into factories, smokestacks, and workers' tenements. The revelation seemed to age him before our eyes. His hands shook uncontrollably as he struggled to light a cigarette. And I noticed. His usually immaculate appearance had become increasingly disheveled. "Crispin never mentioned any of this to you?" Poirot inquired with gentle persistence. "Nothing. He spoke of financial pressures, of difficult decisions that might be necessary, but I never imagined." Nigel's voice broke slightly. "This estate has been our family's heritage for centuries. The thought of it being destroyed for industrial development, it's unthinkable." Our conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Serafina, who moved with her characteristic ethereal grace, despite the shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene with evident concern. "Nigel, you look dreadful. What's happened?" When we explained the discovery of the sale negotiations, her reaction surprised me. Rather than the shock I expected, she displayed a resigned sadness that suggested the news was not entirely unexpected. "I suspected something of the sort," she admitted, settling gracefully into a chair near the window. Crispin had been increasingly distant these past months, spending hours locked away with business correspondence. When I asked about his concerns, he would only say that difficult decisions lay ahead. "You were not happy in your marriage, madame?" Poirot asked with his characteristic directness. Serafina's calmness wavered a bit. "Happiness is perhaps too much to expect from any marriage, Mr. Poirot. Crispin was a good man in his way, but we had grown distant. He was consumed by financial worries and family obligations, while I felt increasingly like a ghost myself, haunting these halls with no real purpose. Hence, your evening walks? They provided my only peace to move freely through the grounds, to breathe the night air without the weight of expectations and disappointments. It was my sole escape from the suffocating atmosphere of duty and decline." As the afternoon progressed, the full scope of the family's crisis became clear. The estate's financial situation was indeed dire, with mounting debts and declining income forcing consideration of measures that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. The conflict between preserving family heritage and accepting modern financial realities had apparently driven Sir Crispin to desperate considerations. Yet throughout these revelations, Poirot maintained his methodical approach, asking precise questions about timing, details, and circumstances that seemed peripheral to the main tragedy. I found his focus on such minutiae increasingly maddening. When faced with the dramatic elements of the case, as evening approached, we gathered in the drawing room, where the family's portraits seemed to gaze down with accumulated disapproval at the current generation's failures. The weight of tradition and expectation felt almost tangible in the gathering dusk. 21 generations, Nigel repeated softly, staring up at the painted faces of his ancestors. And I would have been the one to see it all destroyed. The autumn wind picked up outside, rattling the ancient windows and sending shadows dancing across the room. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the church bells marking the evening hour, their bronze voices carrying across the Yorkshire landscape as they had for centuries past. Chapter 7. The Trap in the Tower. The fifth evening of our stay at Grimswood Grange brought with it an atmosphere of almost palpable tension. The household had grown increasingly unsettled as the investigation progressed, and I noticed that conversations tended to halt abruptly when Poirot or I entered a room. Even the normally unflappable Jenkins seemed nervous, his usually precise movements betraying an underlying anxiety. It was Dr. Thorne who brought us the startling news that was to transform our understanding of the case entirely. "Mr. Poirot." He called, hurrying into the library where we had been reviewing the annotated volume of Grimsby legends. "The most extraordinary thing has occurred. The Grey Lady has appeared again." I felt a distinct chill run down my spine at this announcement. Again, when? Where? Just now. Not 10 minutes past. I was in my study when I heard Mrs. Whitmore cry out from the museum. She had been working late, cataloging some recent acquisitions, when she observed the figure gliding past the windows that faced toward the tower. We followed Dr. Thorne to the museum wing, where we found Mrs. Whitmore in a state of considerable distress. The poor woman was pale as parchment, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely hold her cup of tea. "Oh, Mr. Poirot," she gasped. It was the most terrifying sight. I was arranging the medieval manuscripts when movement outside caught my eye. There, clear as daylight against the tower stones, was the Grey Lady herself. "You observed this apparition clearly, madam." "Perfectly clearly." A tall figure in flowing gray garments moving along the battlements with that characteristic floating motion. It lasted perhaps 3 or 4 minutes before disappearing entirely. Serafina and Nigel had also witnessed the manifestation from different vantage points in the house. Their accounts corroborated Mrs. Whitmore's description in every particular. The gray clothing, the ethereal movement, the location near the tower's upper level. "This settles the matter," I declared to Poirot once we had gathered all the testimony. "We're clearly dealing with genuine supernatural phenomena. The Grey Lady has returned to claim vengeance for some ancient wrong." To my amazement, Poirot's response was not the skeptical dismissal I expected. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully and announced a plan that struck me as absolute madness. "Trebia Hastings, if the Grey Lady wishes to manifest herself, then Hercule Poirot shall give her the opportunity to do so properly. Tonight, I shall spend the evening in the Bloody Tower. Perhaps this ghost and we can have a little conversation, n'est-ce pas?" "Poirot," I exclaimed in horror, "you can't possibly be serious. The tower is clearly haunted. And after what happened to Sir Crispin because of what happened to Sir Crisper, my friend. The truth. She hides in that tower, and tonight Poirot will discover what it is." The entire household erupted in protests when Poirot announced his intention. Nigel declared it was far too dangerous. Serafina begged him to reconsider, and even the stoic Jenkins expressed concerns about the wisdom of such an undertaking. "Mr. Poirot," Dr. Thorne said earnestly, "I've studied the Grey Lady legend for 20 years. She appears only when tragedy threatens the family. To deliberately caught her attention might be inviting disaster, but Poirot remained immovable in his decision. The investigation, it has reached a point where direct action is required. Tonight, all will be revealed." Despite my vehement protests and offers to accompany him, Poirot insisted on entering the tower alone. "The Grey Lady, she is shy, I think. Too many observers, and she will not appear. But Poirot by himself, that is different." As darkness fell, I watched with growing anxiety as my friend made his preparations. He equipped himself with a small electric torch, his magnifying glass, and that peculiar assortment of items he always carried for his investigations. Most unusually, he also took a small vial of what appeared to be powder and several sheets of white paper. "What on earth are those for?" I inquired, but he merely smiled mysteriously and tapped the side of his nose. The sight of Poirot walking across the moonlit grounds toward the Bloody Tower was one I shall never forget. His small, precise figure appeared almost absurdly vulnerable against the backdrop of the ancient stone structure, yet he moved with characteristic confidence and purpose. I positioned myself at the library window, which provided the best view of the tower, determined to maintain watch throughout the night. The other members of the household had retired, though I suspected none would sleep peacefully with Poirot conducting his mysterious vigil. For the first hour, nothing occurred. The tower stood silent and dark against the star-filled sky, betraying no sign of either ghostly or human activity. I found myself growing drowsy despite my anxiety, the warmth of the library fire and the comfortable chair conspiring against my vigilance. It was shortly past 11 o'clock when I heard the first sounds, a distant cry that seemed to echo from the direction of the tower. My blood ran cold as I strained to identify the source, but the night had fallen silent again. Then, perhaps 20 minutes later, came a second cry, more distinct and unmistakably human. It was followed by what sounded like a struggle, muffled sounds of conflict that carried across the still air with terrifying clarity. I could bear the suspense no longer. Seizing a torch from the library desk, I rushed from the house and hurried across the grounds toward the tower. My heart pounded with dread as I imagined what I might discover. Perhaps Poirot fallen victim to whatever malevolent force had claimed Sir Crispin. The tower door stood open, which I took as an ominous sign. I called out as I approached, but received no immediate response. Inside, my torch beam revealed nothing unusual in the circular chamber where Sir Crispin had met his fate. "Poirot," I called again, my voice echoing hollowly in the stone space. "Ah, Hastings," came his familiar voice from above, most punctual as always. "Please join me on the battlements carefully. The stairs are treacherous in the darkness." I found him, standing calmly on the tower's upper level, apparently examining something in the pale moonlight. To my relief, he appeared entirely unharmed, though his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of activity. His jacket was slightly askew, and there were traces of dust on his trousers. "Good Lord, Poirot," I heard sounds of struggle. "What happened?" "A BIA, my friend. The Grey Lady and I, we have indeed had our meeting." Most illuminating it was, though perhaps not in the way our witnesses might expect. He held up a small piece of fabric that gleamed pale in the moonlight. "Observe this fragment, Hastings, caught upon a stone projection during our little encounter, and regard this." He gestured toward his magnifying glass, which lay open beside a white sheet of paper. "Most interesting traces for our chemical analysis." "Chemical analysis? What are you talking about?" "The perfume Monami, a very modern scent and quite distinctive. Not the sort of fragrance one expects from a 16th century ghost, I think." I stared at him in bewilderment. "Are you saying the Grey Lady is not supernatural? The Grey Lady?" "She is certainly not supernatural, but she is very real indeed, and very much connected to the murder of Sir Crispin. Come, let us examine these architectural features that have proved so illuminating." He led me to a section of the battlement wall that appeared identical to the rest, but under his guidance, I could see subtle differences: worn spots in the stone, scratches that suggested frequent use, and what looked like a concealed mechanism. As we made our way back to the house, Poirot's manner suggested the satisfaction of a man who had finally grasped the solution to a complex puzzle. The pieces of fabric and the mysterious chemical traces he had collected seemed to have provided the final evidence he required. The autumn wind had picked up during our adventure, sending clouds scudding across the moon and creating shifting shadows that danced across the ancient grounds. Yet I felt that the real shadows, those of mystery and deception that had shrouded Grimswood Grange, were finally beginning to lift under the methodical illumination of Poirot's investigation. Chapter 8. The Grey Lady's True Story. The next night, we assembled in Grimswood Grange's library for what I now knew to be one of Poirot's dramatic revelations. Jenkins stood at respectful attention by the door. Mrs. Whitmore sat nervously on the edge of a straight-backed chair. Dr. Thorne in his usual chair, surrounded by scholarly volumes, and the whole household was there, including Nigel and Seraphina sitting close to the fireplace. With his hands clasped behind his back and his gray eyes displaying that strange gleam I had come to associate with moments of victory, Poirot had positioned himself in front of the gathered group with his usual accuracy. He started in his most formal way. "Mimi, it seems that there is no logical way to explain this mystery. In a locked tower, a man was killed. Multiple witnesses reported seeing supernatural apparitions, and the crime appears to have all the characteristics of ghostly vengeance. However, I can now assure you that this affair is solely about human hearts motivated by earthly passions, not ghosts. I looked at the faces around me, observing the mix of anxiety and excitement that Poirot's words always evoked. Nigel looked especially gaunt, his hands shaking a little as he grabbed his cigarette case. "Let us begin with the locked room mystery that so baffled the local police," Poirot said. "There appears to be no other way to enter or exit the tower, which is secured from the inside and has high windows that are impossible to navigate. However, someone went into that tower, killed someone, and then disappeared. How did this get done?" He moved to the fireplace, his small figure commanding attention through sheer force of personality. "The answer, Mimi, lies in the tower's medieval construction. During my vigil last evening, I discovered what the builders of 1380 intended to remain hidden. A secret passage connecting the tower to the main house, accessible through a concealed mechanism in the battlement wall." Dr. Thorne leaned forward with scholarly excitement. "A secret passage, but I've studied the tower's architecture for 20 years. Presses him on, Doctor, because you studied it as a historian, not as a detective. The passage entrance is cunningly concealed within what appears to be ordinary stone work, but the mechanism bears signs of recent use. Scratches on the stone, worn spots where hands have gripped, traces of modern dust and fabric." Poirot produced the piece of gray material he had collected the previous evening. "This fragment, caught upon a stone projection during my encounter with our Gray Lady, will prove most significant. For you see, the supernatural manifestations that have terrified this household were carefully orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of both the family legends and the estate's hidden architectural features." Serafina's face had grown pale as winter moonlight. "You're suggesting someone deliberately created the ghost sightings, mais oui, madame? Someone who knew that the Gray Lady legend would provide perfect cover for a carefully planned murder. Someone who could arrange for witnesses to observe the apparition at precisely the right moment to establish an alibi and create confusion about the crime's supernatural nature." I found myself completely absorbed by Poirot's reconstruction, though I confess the solution remained beyond my grasp. "But the Gray Lady was seen by multiple witnesses," I protested. "Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Thorne, even villagers in the town." "Indeed, Hastings, and that is the key to understanding our murderer's method. The sightings were real, but the figure was not supernatural. Someone wearing a flowing gray garment appeared on the battlements at carefully calculated times, creating the illusion of ghostly activity while providing cover for the real purpose." Poirot's gaze settled on Serafina with gentle but inexorable certainty. "Madame Grimsby, you mentioned wearing your gray cashmere shawl during your evening walks. A beautiful garment, and one that would appear quite spectral when viewed from a distance in moonlight." Serafina's composure began to crumble. "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "I suggest that someone asked you to walk the battlements on the night of the murder, perhaps as a romantic gesture or a whimsical surprise for your husband. You obligingly donned your gray shawl and provided the ghostly sighting that multiple witnesses observed." The truth was beginning to dawn on me with horrifying clarity. "You mean she was an unwitting accomplice?" "Precisimo. While Madame Serafina provided the supernatural distraction, the real murderer used the secret passage to enter the tower, kill Sir Crispin with the stolen dagger, and escape unseen. The locked room mystery was merely clever staging." Nigel had gone chalk white, his cigarette forgotten and burning down between trembling fingers. "This is all speculation, Mr. Poirot. You have no proof." "Ah, but I do, monsieur. First, the annotated volume that Dr. Thorne lent to someone in the household. The marginal notes reveal detailed study of the Gray Lady legend and most significantly historical references to the tower's secret passage. The handwriting, when compared to your personal correspondence, proves most revealing." Dr. Thorne stared at Nigel with dawning comprehension. You borrowed my book, but why didn't you simply ask about the family legends directly? Because, Poirot answered, he needed to research the details without arousing suspicion. Second, we have the evidence of my chemical analysis. The perfume traces I collected from the tower were not medieval fragrance, but a modern scent. Specifically, the ode to Cologne that Nessuno favors. Nigel's voice came out as barely a whisper. Circumstantial evidence, nothing more, perhaps, but then we have the physical proof. Poirot moved closer to where Nigel sat frozen in his chair. Your gold cufflink, Monsieur, the left one bears traces of a very specific type of limestone dust, found only in the passage connecting the tower to the main house. Dust that would accumulate on clothing during passage through that confined space. I watched in fascination as Nigel's defenses finally crumbled completely. His shoulders sagged and the cigarette fell from his nerveless fingers to the carpet. The motive, Poirot continued relentlessly, was not greed or hatred, but love. Love of family heritage twisted into destructive obsession. When you discovered your brother's plan to sell Grimswood Grange to industrial developers, you could not bear the thought of 21 generations of family history being destroyed. In your mind, murdering Crispin was the only way to preserve what you held sacred. He was going to destroy everything, Nigel whispered, his voice breaking. Centuries of family heritage sold to factory builders for the sake of mere money. I couldn't let that happen. So you planned the perfect crime, Poirot said with gentle sadness. You stole the ceremonial dagger, researched the family legends to create your supernatural cover, and persuaded your sister-in-law to provide the ghostly distraction. You used the secret passage known only to Grimsbys to enter the locked tower, killed your brother, and escaped unseen. The Grey Lady sightings ensured that everyone would focus on supernatural explanations rather than human ones. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Jenkins stepped forward quietly to stand behind Nigel's chair, his military bearing evident as he prepared to assist with whatever unpleasant duties lay ahead. I wanted to preserve our heritage, Nigel said finally, his voice hollow with despair. Instead, I destroyed it more completely than any industrial development ever could. As the local police were summoned and the grim formalities began, I found myself reflecting on the tragic irony of the case. In seeking to preserve his family's honor through murder, Nigel had instead brought upon the Grimsby name, a scandal that would echo through history long after any factory development might have been forgotten. The ancient stones of Grimswood Grange had witnessed many secrets over the centuries, but perhaps none more poignant than this tale of love, transformed into betrayal and heritage preserved through its own destruction.